I understand it's 9 o'clock. Let's just give one more minute as a lot of people are signing in, and we'll start in a minute. Well, good morning. Let's get started then. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Cecilia Tornaghi. I'm a managing editor at America's Quarterly. I'll be your moderator this morning, and on behalf of America's Quarterly and the Council of the Americas and CEBRI, the Center for Brazilian International Relations Studies, I want to welcome you this morning to our panel, Brazil-U.S. Relationship in 2020 and beyond. This program is a co-production of CEBRI and ASCOA, and we'll discuss this pivotal and consequential relationship, which has taken a singular, maybe more personal approach since the 2018 election in Brazil. And for that look, we will count on experienced and wise words, first of all, of Ambassador Sergio Amaral. Hard to think of a person with a more unique position to discuss this moment. He was, of course, Brazil's top representative in Washington, D.C. just up to last year. He was appointed to the Brazilian embassy in the United States by former President Michel Temer. He was also Brazil's top diplomat in the UK, in France, among other posts, took part on what led to the creation of the WTO, was also in several domestic posts from Trade Ministry and others, including posts in the Environmental Ministry. So really a keen eye and a great experience to look at this moment of this relationship. And of course, Brian Winter, our editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, will also be debating and discussing this relationship. Brian is Vice President for Policy at ASCOA and also an author of several best-selling books. Brian has been following Latin America, and especially Brazil, for a couple of decades now. He also had firsthand experience by living in Brazil and continued following. He has a keen eye and incredible knowledge of the country. So it's going to be a very, very interesting and enticing discussion that we will have. Of course, you will also be part of this conversation. You can ask questions. So if you are on the WebEx platform, you can use the Q&A moderator mode and then ask your questions there. If you are on the live stream or on social media, you can also ask questions. All you have to do is use the handle at ASCOA, or you can use the at Amer Quarterly. Shorten America's Quarterly to Amer Quarterly. Use either handle and we will get your questions. But before we get started with that discussion, we also have a treat for you. Detail, I need to ask you. If you're on the WebEx, please keep your mic on mute so that we don't have an interference in the discussion whenever you have to that. So please keep your mics on mute. But so before we start, I want to say that we have a treat right now. We're also going to have opening remarks by Henrique Rezinski, who's a trustee at CEBRI and is going to give us some words. He's also very close to the U.S.-Brazil relationship and will also now give us some opening remarks. Henrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor on behalf of CEBRI to partner with the Council of Americas in promoting this debate on Brazil-U.S. relations in 2020 and beyond. Just a few words on what we have been doing at CEBRI. We have a dedicated working group dealing with the U.S.-Brazil relations, basically aiming to study and propose actions to deepen this relation. Our perspective is to structurally look beyond our present both administrations, but also use the present window of opportunity to revisit or propose new initiatives in areas, some delicate areas such as defense, security, also science and technology, commerce, investments, infrastructure, energy, public health, and others. And also including a geopolitical dialogue between our two countries. And for sure, the next elections in the US has also been objects of our debates. This is exactly why we are so eager to hear both Ambassador Amaral and Brian on this very important topic. I wish you all a very fruitful debate. Thank you.
With the center, it's a privilege. So, as you said, elections coming up. November is really shy of 4 months away, and I myself don't recall an election, a U.S. election, that could be this consequential for the U.S.-Brazil relationship, at least in the front. And few Brazilian presidents, if any, have turned this relationship as personal as we have seen with President Bolsonaro and President Trump. So now we have November coming up, and I would like to start with you, Ambassador Amaral. You arrived here. You were here exactly to work, improve on this relationship, and it had been bruised by spying scandals. That was the coming out of the impeachment and put everything in the back burner for international relations. So, and you oversaw the initial strokes also of this new relationship, the Bolsonaro-Trump since there. So, where do you think we are today? Where do you see the Brazil-U.S. relationship today?
Good morning, Cecilia, Brian, Enrique. It's good to see you here. I'm very happy to participate in this important discussion. I think the relations are good. And I think relations between the U.S. and Brazil have always been good. And why? Because we have a very strong background. We share many principles. We have the same inheritance from ideas and culture and history. From the Romans and Greek, they provided us with the most important values we have. And at the same time, we have recently been working together, and I think in a very effective way. When I took over the embassy, I concentrated on a few projects, and I was happy that by the end of my tenure, some projects have made substantial progress. For instance, the safeguards agreement on technology, which will provide us to reopen or expand the Alcântara space base. In the area of the economy, in trade facilitation, for instance, and in the area of defense, which is a singular area, because no matter what governments we have in both Brazil and the US, the military have their own track and they keep working. And when I arrived at the embassy 3 years ago, I realized that many of the projects taken by the military were working. So I think the election by President Bolsonaro in Brazil strengthened even more this relationship because of the affinities that he shares with President Trump. And as you know well, the good relations between two presidents are very important for making progress in the different areas of cooperation. We have a strong network of affinities, a network of cooperation in the most different areas. As ambassador, sometimes I realized that we had cooperation, and an important cooperation in areas I did not expect. So I am confident that the cooperation is good. I think the friendship is good, and I think and hope it will continue.
Well, it's good to hear. It's good to hear good news for sure, Brian. Where do you see this relationship right now, and how impactful this change in leadership in Brazil has been?
Thank you, Cecilia. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank CEBRI. I'd also like to say what a privilege it is to be on a panel with an esteemed public servant such as Ambassador Sergio Amaral, who I'm proud to call a friend. Let me preface my remarks really briefly by explaining kind of the spirit in which I'm speaking today. I wear a couple different hats these days. I'm editor-in-chief of AQ. I am a political analyst, but over the last 10 days or so, I've really put my old reporter hat back on and have tried to talk to a variety of people, both in the current administration in the U.S., some people in Democratic Party circles, let's say, who might play a future role in a Biden administration, as well as some old friends in the Brazilian foreign ministry in Itamaraty and in Brazil generally. And so what I'm going to try to do today is kind of give, some probably opinion and analysis along the way, but at least at the beginning here, kind of try to faithfully reflect what I've heard from different people. I do so kind of speaking in my own capacity. I'm not affiliated directly or indirectly with either of the U.S. campaigns, and if I make any mistakes in my rendering of sort of their words and their intentions, that's my fault. My impression is that in the early days of the Bolsonaro administration, that what we had was a friendship that was in search of a policy agenda. That we had a president in Jair Bolsonaro who came into office with great enthusiasm for the United States, for reasons that I'll go into a little bit now, and that at the beginning that bureaucracies, and particularly on the U.S. side, were trying to catch up with kind of the deliverables that would help turn that friendship or admiration on the part of Jair Bolsonaro for the United States and for President Trump specifically into action. And, I think it's worth pausing just briefly to remember how central the United States is to Bolsonarismo and kind of the liturgy of that new Brazilian conservative movement as it's existed over the last 10, 15 years or so. Let's not forget that during the campaign, then candidate Bolsonaro not only went to the United States, but that he stood in front of an image of the US flag and saluted it. It's also true that even recently at some of the rallies that we've seen typically on Sundays in Brasília over the last few weeks, that you see a lot of US flags at these rallies. And, as somebody who spends a lot of my day sort of trying to explain Brazil and answer questions about Brazil, sometimes that sparks, people don't quite understand it. And I guess the simplest way to explain it is to say that in the sort of philosophy of Bolsonarismo, that Brazil under governments prior to his was on the path of Venezuela. In their minds, I don't personally agree with this, but in their minds, Brazil was on this socialist path toward authoritarianism, away from capitalism, and therefore, what's the opposite of Venezuela? It's the United States. And this embrace of U.S. symbolism is a way of them sending a message to their base to say that they are in favor of a greater role for the private sector, a smaller role for the Brazilian state, that we're going to create basically a country that is more like the United States, or maybe, if you will, the more Republican parts of South Florida. But basically a place where, you can feel safe, where you will have more freedom to own a gun. And they see this as sort of their north, if you will. At a foreign policy level, it goes deeper than that. They have a foreign minister and a whole sort of ideological movement that has been kind of articulated by the Bolsonaro family guru, Olavo de Carvalho, who lives in the United States, under which Brazil has now kind of switched teams, again, in their imagination, and is now playing on the side of kind of what they describe as a Judeo-Christian world with the U.S. At the forefront. And so that's kind of, that was the attitudes or the sentiments that sort of provoked this desire to get closer to the United States and to the Trump administration, particularly because they see Donald Trump as kind of a very pure, ideal vision of this Western alliance among nations that they want to create. So then it was left up to these foreign policy bureaucracies and some other wings of government as well to kind of catch up. And in doing so, they embraced some points that Ambassador Amaral already mentioned, some things that had been on the agenda for years, such as trade facilitation, such as the base at Alcântara. By the way, under different administrations, what Ambassador Amaral said is correct. Relations, have never been bad. Sometimes they've been cool, as was certainly true when then President Lula tried to engage in negotiations with Iran 10 years ago. But the relationship has always been friendly, and sort of the framework for a bilateral agenda was there. And what I can tell you is that since then, the bureaucracies have kind of caught up. At the moment, you have two ambassadors, Todd Chapman in Brasilia and Nestor Forster in Washington, who are very widely respected, career Foreign Service officers who know the other country very well, have been very effective in terms of pushing this agenda. What it looks like in practice, these are not unimportant things like trade facilitation, things like digital trade, laying the groundwork for sort of future cooperation. A lot of people looked at it and said, where's the big win? I get that. There's a full-fledged trade deal in the near future is probably off the table. U.S. officials have said as much. And what they're left with is sort of these important, less glamorous initiatives to push forth. When I asked one person who was part of the U.S. government what they would point to as a sign of sort of progress or what's the deliverable been in this relationship, this person said, well, we just signed a deal for Maine lobster to be exported to Brazil for the first time. And I'm a journalist by training. We're cynical by nature. I can probably hear people sort of scoffing a little bit as I say that. But the truth is, you put together a lot of things like that, and it does add up to something. Whether it's the big deliverable, whether it's the game-changing thing that people on both sides seem to want, I'm not sure. Anyway, I have more, but let's leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Brian. And what you're describing is, you both is a relationship in the men's between, with two strong men understanding or vouching each other, and the leader in Brazil that's openly rooting for Trump. But we have November coming up, and we don't know what's going to happen. But what we know right now is that Joe Biden is ahead in the polls. So in January, maybe the chances for a second Trump administration were stronger than they are now, but still not out of the roots. Anything could happen between now and November, of course. So it's a coin toss as we stand, but it's a coin toss where the coin could show a Biden face. So what do you expect for 2021? I mean, where is this relationship going from where we are right now? You could get a second Trump administration where things could stay as is, but Brazil aligned with the U.S. and its relationship outside, but you could get a Biden. And that, where does that stand? So Ambassador Amaral, where is your crystal ball for 2021?
My crystal ball isn't saying much, but I think that Brazil-U.S. relations are going possibly through a turning point. And as you mentioned, if Trump is reelected, what doesn't seem likely at this point in time, there will be continuity. And continuity means, I think, Trump sticking to his approach towards nationalism, America first, about populism, and on the foreign front, basically he'll double his bets, double his positions. I don't think that Trump would change substantially its policies abroad, and this will make an uncomfortable prospect for us, to the extent that the continuation of this kind of China-U.S. conflict can put us in a difficult situation, in a difficult dilemma, which is to have, and I don't know why we should, take sides in this dispute. We are not part of this game. We are not part of this dispute. We are not looking for a worldwide hegemony. And we have keen interests on both sides. We would like to keep our very good relationship with the U.S., which is part of our heritage, as I mentioned before, convergence. And we also would like and need to keep a very good partnership with China in the area of economics. China is our first trading partner and is the first investor in Brazil from the point of view of flows. And we would not like to be in a position where we would have to take sides, let's say, to be together with one at the detriment of the other. And there are many countries around the world who feel the same. And I think if this confrontation deteriorates, of course, we will have to look for other alliances, strengthen other alliances with Europe, for instance, with Latin America, in what will be a change in the balance of power of a multilateral world. Now, if we take Biden, I think that Biden should be very interesting, because I think he inherited two important social movements of his campaign. First is Sanders and his group of young, very active people who think about and dream about a substantial change in U.S. society, who think about possibly a new green and at the same time New Deal world, the Green New Deal, which is very popular in Europe, which is popular among Sanders followers. And this will make a big difference with respect to the prospects we have in Brazil. Because the Green New Deal means, first of all, a larger participation of the state, either as an inducer of the economy or reducing inequality. And green, this word, raises some problems for us when you remember what's going on or what went on with Europe in the case of deforestation. So this prospect of a mismatch of the agendas, I call it, now we go more or less in the same direction. With a Biden government, perhaps our agendas would not match. And in foreign policy, there is another point which I personally like, which is multilateralism. But this is not well perceived in Brazil with the present foreign policy. So we would have a mismatch of the agendas, which make things more difficult, mainly in the area of the environment, because the environmental movement will be very active. It will have a strong presence both in Congress and public opinion. And we will have to do more in order not to have too much noise in this relation. And the second point for a Biden government would be to reinforce the isolation of Brazil in the world. We are already isolated. If we talk about our relations with Europe, what people in Europe will say is we are not going to ratify the Mercosur European Union if you do not change in a drastic way your policy towards the Amazon, and if you don't give us results, let's say the figures for deforestation. So we apparently will make a wrong decision to be hostile or more distant from the main partners in the area of trade, in the area of investment. Let's say Europe and China. If we have, together with that, more difficult relations with the Biden government, perhaps for similar reasons, I think we will be very isolated in the world. And many of our projects, domestically and also internationally, may be jeopardized. As to domestic policy, I think it will be quite curious because the United States will probably go in one direction, which is more presence of the states. That's what Sanders proposed, for instance, and he has a strong group with him. And what we're doing in Brazil, we are going in an opposite direction. We have delayed for some time being a more convicted, market-oriented government. And at the time in which we want to have much less state, much more open economy, the world is going in a different situation. Once again, we are delayed vis-a-vis the world, because what we are doing is what we might have done more in the 90s, we're doing now, and we'll be, again, isolated with respect to the overall trend of the world.
Picture of further isolation is that you painted a nice picture of the Brazil-U.S. relationship, but these two are not in a vacuum, right? We are part of a globe where other nations abound, and even if it's the largest economy, Brazil can't rely on U.S. alone. But so, Brian, you said something very interesting also, friendship in search of a policy. I love that quote. But where does it take us in 2021? What is your take of the possibilities of the situation for Brazil-U.S. given the coin toss in November?
Well, so let's talk about what might happen if Biden wins, which I think is what a lot of people want to hear. And look, the keyword being, okay, because it's nearly impossible to sit here in July and try to game out what will happen for an administration that would be taking office in January, especially in the world the way it is right now, with pandemic and economies in free fall and everything else happening. There are several other key factors, such as who would be Secretary of State under a Biden administration, which would have a huge influence. What kind of the balance of power is between, as Ambassador Amaral mentioned, the kind of the progressive wing versus the more moderate wing within the Democratic Party. We just don't know, and we won't start to know if Biden is elected until November, December, so it's very hard to try to game out. That said, so look, there is a perception that you see in the Brazilian media, certainly repeated by people in Brazilian politics, that because President Bolsonaro has been so out in front on, basically supporting Donald Trump. And, this includes everything from one of his sons, Eduardo Bolsonaro, famously walking he walked out of the Trump hotel wearing a Make America Great Again hat. You don't get a whole lot more partisan than that, right? And there have been other statements since. That was back in, I think, 2018, before Bolsonaro even took office, but he has made his preferences clear. And as a result, there's a perception, again, in Brazilian media, elsewhere, that basically a Biden administration might try to somehow shun, ostracize Bolsonaro and therefore Brazil, There's even talk that it's a government that could try to pass sanctions against Brazil because of what's happening in the Amazon. Based on what I heard, that is emphatically not the case. Emphatically not the case. I think what you'll see instead, again, based on sort of my understanding of what I've heard from people over the last couple of days, what you're likely to see instead is a president, at least in the White House, who is open to a constructive or cordial relationship with Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil. Why? Because they know that they're going to inherit, if they win, an extremely complex world in January 2021. It's going to be a Latin America and a Western world generally that's going to be clawing its way out of an extremely deep recession. And they are going to need all the help they can get. They also seem to understand, and this is an area where the Democratic Party establishment has perhaps evolved over the last couple of years, they are increasingly prone to see China as an adversary and understand that Brazil is an important partner in that division. And look, what Ambassador Amaral said about, gosh, I hope we don't have to choose sides, is a very common sentiment in Brazil for very just patently obvious reasons, because of trade and any number of factors, as well as the general Brazilian preference in foreign policy circles going back decades prior to this administration for a multipolar world, which was always part of kind of the Brazilian foreign ministry doctrine. But so, look, there would definitely, Ambassador Amaral used the word uncomfortable, I think, to describe what a relationship might look like. I think the relationship would probably be at a personal level a bit uncomfortable. But I don't think, based on what I've heard, I don't think it would be hostile, at least not on day one. I think that, you have a person in Joe Biden who has the instinct, maybe realistically, maybe not, of trying to give leaders the space to do the right thing. Now, the question becomes whether President Bolsonaro would take advantage of that space. And this is where, to put a little bit of my own analysis in there, even if a Biden administration comes in on day one with a more constructive attitude toward Bolsonaro's Brazil than people expect, they may be bound for conflict anyway. Now, let me very briefly explain why. The Amazon issue. It's pretty simple. The Amazon issue is not going to go away. And you have a government that both publicly and behind closed doors, talking about the Bolsonaro government here, continues to believe that what it has is a public relations problem, a perception problem, instead of a reality problem. And as long as they believe that problem, I believe, is unlikely to be addressed in a meaningful way. And they've gotten some cover from the Trump administration on this issue. You had the huge controversy back in 12 months ago, last summer in the Northern Hemisphere. President Trump provided some cover. If you try to imagine, I think a lot's going to be determined by what happens over these next couple of weeks in terms of the atmospheric elements of what happens in 2020. But if we get to 2021 and the reality is continuing to get worse instead of get better, that's when basically the Brazil issue leaves the portfolio of the foreign policy professionals and starts becoming a domestic policy issue, and particularly for that progressive wing within his coalition. And that's where I think, even if it starts off less hostile than some people think, if that issue continues to remain, if it continues to get worse, and if the progressive wing of that government takes notice, that's where I think things, you could start to see fireworks.
As a matter of fact, there's a question that came in on WebEx right on that point. Felipe Molter was asking, what do you guys believe that a Joe Biden agenda for Brazil would be when it comes to environmental protection sector? So Ambassador Amaral, we heard a little bit from Brian on that. I don't know if he wants to add some more, but want to hear from you as well. What do you think that Biden's agenda would be when it comes to the environmental situation?
Yeah. Let me try to follow some of the points raised first by Brian. I agree that there is no reason for a hostile relationship between Brazil and the U.S. for the reasons I pointed out before at the beginning. We work on a background of very traditional friendship and cooperative relations, and this will not change. The Brazilian society is basic American. We think we are Europeans, but we are Americans. There's a very strong cultural relationship, very strong historic ties. There is very sound economic relationships. We didn't mention the business community because apparently it became silent in some years ago. And we did, during my tenure in Washington, I didn't have the contact with the CEO forum because there was none. The participants of the American side were not elected. So I think we have a solid background, but we should be prepared, I think, Brazilians, to a recurrent friction in our relations with the United States for this sensitive issue of the Amazon. And I agree that we are not going to change in a drastic way. The former German ambassador living in Brazil some weeks ago, he said the issue of the Amazons require drastic measures, quick measures, and continuous measures. And I agree with that. And what is the problem? As in many other issues, the subject or the challenge of the Amazon brought about a division in the government. How can General Mourão, who is the president of the Amazon Council, and I agree with what he's trying to do, how will he accomplish what he proposed to do if there is a division? And at his side, during the negotiations, he had the Minister for the Environment, who was against the environment, against the climate contention, opposition, change. And I think this is the sensitive problem for many of our relations with Europe, possibly with the United States. I don't know to what extent these frictions may become a very serious matter. I think in rhetoric, possibly, but I don't think the substance will change considerably because we have very strong forces who will be fighting for keeping the relations good. What we may have, and this prospect I don't like at all, this is something I have been trying to avoid during the period I was in Washington, is kind of this pendulum movement, which has characterized the Brazil-U.S. relations for many years or decades. Sometimes we are close or too close, sometimes we are distant or too distant. And this is very bad. I think we should reach, and this was the main thrust of my effort in Washington, to reach a mature relationship in which we don't have a pro or against position vis-a-vis the United States a priori. And we have governments that are a priori against the United States, and some other governments who are a priori in favor and to want to align to the United States. And this is very bad. It is time we take a more mature approach. And what would that be? To assess and to decide on each one of the items of our bilateral agenda on its merits. If this West subject is important for us, we coincide or not to work together. And if we don't coincide, why not to say we don't agree with that? Because what we may have is, as I mentioned, good relations, but we'll not be able to connect because these different frictions will prevent us from going further.
Thank you, Ambassador. I mean, I'd like to continue on. I think it's an amazing topic, but we are being flooded with questions about another relationship here. Several questions coming on China. Of course, China, U.S., and Brazil having to take a position, especially the situation with Huawei. So we have a few months until November anyway, and the pressure, the relationship between U.S. and China is definitely warming up, I'd say this way. So where does Brazil stand, and where, is the pressure and sensitive situation between China and U.S., and where does Brazil stand in the middle? What are the options going forward? Brian, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, I want to talk about China. Let me just quickly go back to and revisit one point from the previous set, addressing what Ambassador said. And this has to do with kind of relative priorities and how Brazil fits in with an overall foreign policy agenda in the United States, no matter who gets elected. This is a panel on the U.S.-Brazil relationship. So we're talking about the U.S.-Brazil relationship in great detail, but in a bit of isolation. I just want to pause for a second and say that for Washington, for better, for worse, I think under both administrations, even within the Latin American portfolio, Brazil is not, and probably in the future will not be, front and center, let's say, when it comes to that Latin American agenda. Even under the current administration, we had the nominee for the new assistant secretary position in the Americas have a confirmation hearing this week, and it did not go unnoticed in Brazil that in his prepared remarks, the word Venezuela was mentioned 7 times, Cuba was mentioned 4 times, Mexico 7 times, Brazil once, as part of a list of countries who signed an MOU on private sector investment. And so, that at least at some level gives you a data point that kind of shows the overall priority for this. And look, I think that'll continue to be true if there's a second Trump administration. And based on what I heard, it would probably continue to be true in a Biden administration. There's a view in some Democratic foreign policy circles that at the end of the day, Brazil is sort of a natural ally in some respects for the United States, but also that these are 2 agricultural powers whose economies don't fit particularly well together. And that, yes, let's have increased business. Yes, let's have increased trade. But as a true strategic partner that would sort of merit a lot of attention and time, even under the best of circumstances, that's difficult. And especially if you've got a government that you don't particularly like in Jair Bolsonaro, you're just not going to waste or spend the time and capital that are the most valuable things that a president has. So that's kind of if we take a step back from this topic, that's what I've been hearing. As far as the China question, look, the true authority on this is Ambassador Amaral. So I'll be very brief and just repeat back something that I heard recently from, let's say, a decades-long practitioner of Brazilian politics, who said to me on this question, he said, Brazil has to take advantage of our strategic advantages. What is our strategic advantage? We are far. Okay. We are far away. We are on the periphery. And what he meant by that is basically, I hope we don't have to choose. And if we do have to choose between one country or the other, if we are returning to a 20th century Cold War style bipolar world where you sort of have to be either the white piece on the chessboard or the black piece on the chessboard, I hope that we get to wait as long as we possibly can to do that, because it will be traumatic no matter what we choose because of that commercial relationship. Now, that is kind of the view of the traditional foreign policy establishment, I suppose, but it's not the view of, let's say, the majority of at least the current leadership of the Brazilian foreign ministry, where you have, basically a conflict between Minister Araújo, who I think it's safe to say is a China skeptic, if not openly anti-China. And that's a debate that's happening within that administration against basically people who have a more business-minded perspective, mainly agribusiness, who don't want to see Brazil slip into that kind of binary choice for what they see as ideological reasons. That's sort of the lay of the land, and I would leave it to the ambassador to take us into more granularity.
Yes, definitely, Ambassador, please.
I may touch the points Brian raised and which are very important. As to the fact that the U.S. doesn't pay to Brazil attention, this is a recurrent issue. Since I started dealing with the United States a long time ago, I used to hear that. Is that good or bad? Because if the United States is very closely following Brazil, the level of interference would be higher, and our space of autonomy perhaps would be less important. I don't care about that. That's true. And many Brazilians are very upset when they come to the United States or to New York or to Washington. They go to a meeting, to a conference, and you realize how many people from Central America are there, much more than Brazilians. I really don't care about that. This is not what matters. What matters is our capacity to go along with the United States in a way which provides good returns for both countries. If it is to be closer, under the perspective of Bolton in his book of the resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine, I would not like that. I prefer to be far away. Now, as to China, I was very much involved in China, and Brian knows that. I was the chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council for 5 or 6 years. And we did the first research studies on China investment in Brazil. And I think I know more or less well this relationship. It's totally different. We have an economic approach, and we would not like to be jeopardized by a conflict which is not ours. Why should we take sides? Why should you not consider our national interests when we look at both relations? Huawei is in Brazil. 40 to 50% of the telecom market is already in the hands of Huawei. The study made by the military, it's a very cautious study, shows that Huawei doesn't raise more insecurity than any other telecom company, because this will depend not what Huawei wishes or not. This will depend on legislation and the kind of monitoring we are prepared to ensure. I don't think this will be decided for political, technical reasons. I think it's a good idea to postpone it, and I think we will postpone it for next year, and then we'll take the decision. But what is very important with a new administration in Brazil is that the people who will be in charge, and some of them know that Brazil is a very large country with many interests around the world. And it is natural and justified that we should have economic and political space to take the decisions which are in our interest. And we have a diplomacy of our own. And this is also something that is important and I think should be respected.
I would just, I would just note, though, that the ground is shifting really fast on this issue. And what happened in England this week, vis-a-vis Huawei and Chinese telecommunications in general, definitely was cheered by these anti-China folks in the Bolsonaro administration as, in their minds, kind of setting the stage for an inevitable, refusal or inevitable no to Huawei as part of the Brazilian infrastructure. So, and in other sort of capitals around the world as well. So it's amazing to me how quickly this story is moving right now. And again, this change that you hear within the Democratic Party establishment as well, it seems much to me, based on what I hear and read, much more prone to see China in terms that are not that different from what the Trump administration has been saying over the last, 3.5 years.
To follow up this point, because otherwise we will keep discussing China, as always happens. And if you read carefully the decision taken by the UK, it's not what the rhetoric says, because it will prohibit new purchases of Huawei equipment from January on. And you start reducing the participation in Huawei from January on. And it will take 7 years. Can you believe that this should need to take 7 years, or are the British just postponing a decision which is very uncomfortable for them? Because if you go to substance, there is very little there. But there was another point you mentioned. I think that the main problem with China, or with this dilemma, is that it is divisive in Brazil, as you mentioned. And we will create another issue of polarization, because there's a very strong part of the Brazilian society that sees no problem with having Huawei here. And there's a strong part of the Brazilian society who doesn't want us to have Huawei here. This is another item of polarization and division in a society which is already very polarized.
And the word you said, a diplomacy of our own. You're gonna get there. We were like almost there at our time, but I would like to raise another topic that has been some pressure on Brazil on and off, which is Venezuela. So changing for 2021, if there is a change of guard, does it change, or will there be continuous pressure on Brazil to take a stance for further action when it comes to Venezuela, Ambassador?
Yes, Cecilia. First, we would like to understand pressure on what? Because if you talk about Venezuela being seen as a threat to the U.S. security, I have never seen it. When you have the document on defense and on U.S. security, they don't even mention Venezuela. What they see as a threat, it is Iran, it is Korea, it is Russia, but Venezuela is not a priority. Venezuela is a matter of domestic policy in the United States. And I think that the United States has never considered in a serious way a military action against Venezuela. I don't think we have been together with the U.S. in the context of the Lima Group in all the measures that were proposed. And we have no problem of discussing and taking measures against Venezuela in the context of the OAS. But I hope, we'll never take any unilateral military measure against Venezuela. We are quite well protected. There are 2,000 kilometers of Amazon forest. And in this sense, the Amazon forest helps us a lot.
Brian, do you want to add on that? We still have another question here. If you want to add on Venezuela?
Yeah, I'll just be really brief. I mean, I see some things differently on this issue. I mean, I think the impact that Venezuela has on sort of the security and well-being of the whole hemisphere as a result of its terrible crisis is clear. And it's clear in, if for no other reason than the more than 4 million people who've had to flee because of hunger and political oppression and other reasons, many of them who have come to Brazil. Now, does that rise to the level of a security issue for Brazil per se? That's, I suppose, let's just let that one go. But, what does it mean in practice? I think that there may have been an opportunity in 2019 for a change of leadership in Venezuela. It didn't happen. It seems, people who follow the story more closely than I do seem to believe that cycle that alignment, that seeming alignment that we had in 2019 could potentially take years to repeat itself. I don't hear a lot of optimism for those who are looking for, a change in government. And so, what Brazil's role in that? No, I don't foresee circumstances under which there would be a military invasion of Venezuela, nor do I see one in which Brazil would participate. It's not part of its tradition. I do believe that, the Bolsonaro administration cares sincerely about what happens in Venezuela, just as the Trump administration does. A lot of it gets seen through the lens of South Florida politics, but I think some of it's heartfelt as well. I mean, as somebody who follows that crisis, my heart breaks every day because of the starvation and everything else happening there. But as what it means at a policy level, what it means for the Brazil-U.S. relationship, for better or for worse, probably not much.
We are running out of time, but Ambassador Mara, you were muted. Just that we have one last question for you, Ambassador, if you don't mind. We're running out of time. We have one last question that I'm leaving to close, which is coming from Carlos Guimarães, asking whether if we're being too optimistic of a relationship with the Biden administration, wouldn't it be probable that the Olavista side that has a large influence on today's diplomacy would try to double down? That's the question for you, Ambassador.
I don't think that the Olavista group has such an influence. Many people think about the present foreign minister as too much influenced by Olavo. That's not the case. He was put in the government by the children, by the sons of the president. And I don't think this is a very important variable in our foreign policy. It has some influence. It has influence domestically, but the issues of foreign policy will be decided much more under the influence of the military, and they are very concerned about that. When I said that this was not a security threat or a defense threat, I do not exclude that this is for us a big concern from a health point of view, from a social point of view, from the deterioration of institutions, and this has to be taken care of. And the people who I think are most influent in this area are the military, because the military are very concerned with the Amazon, and many of these military people had been posted in Caracas. They know the Venezuelans' military groups quite well. They talk to each other, they phone to each other. And I think they should be, as well as the foreign minister, should be concerned about what's going on in Venezuela. But there isn't much we can do, except if you consider an unilateral measure that I don't think we'll take.
Brian, your final consideration.
I would just add on this. I mean, I think the debate between the military and the Olavistas for control of the Brazilian foreign policy agenda is real. And I maintain good contacts with several people on kind of both sides of that debate. And I can tell you that they are debating each other publicly and behind the scenes every day. But interestingly, where they come together and sort of circling back to, looking into 2021, where they're more or less united is in that, I suppose you could call it nationalistic impulse, that resistance, that real distaste for the world telling Brazil what to do. That's where they end up, at least in some quarters, being somewhat united. And of course, that's a pressure point on the Amazon issue. The military has kind of a different view of this than the Olavista part, which tends to sort of just not even really think it's a real problem. They think that it's basically a cudgel that the globalists are using and the protectionists in Europe, and even I've heard the socialists and the communists are using to sort of, beat on Brazil in a public environment. The military is more inclined to embrace the data that the government itself produces. But where they meet is in this, every time the world sort of starts doing this, they do this, and it creates a dynamic that makes the problem less likely to be solved and therefore may contribute further to this conflictive environment that we may see by the middle of next year.
Let us beat each other at home. Don't come telling us anything to do. Gentlemen, I think this conversation could last another, several hours. It's just so interesting. And this subject alone, I think would take us much longer, but unfortunately we are out of time. But I do want to thank you. I want to thank Ambassador Amaral very much for giving us your time here in this discussion. Brian, of course, bringing all this knowledge for us. And Henrique Rezinski, thank you so much also, and to CEBRI for this partnership, which was great, the beginning of a long collaboration. And of course, to our team as well, everyone in the background that made this happen today. We wouldn't be able to do this if there weren't a lot of other people in the background helping us today. To all of you, of course, for joining us. Thank you so much. Stay tuned at americasquarterly.org and asua.org, where we have many programs, very interesting programs happening that we can reach from anywhere in the world. But we're still in a pandemic out there, so please stay safe and stay well. Thank you so much.